But before Pilate left Jerusalem to go up to his capital, Caesarea, he said to me, "We have learned from Marcus Petronius that the Jews do make use in their temple of figures of mystic birds, so their opposition to the Roman eagle is based on political and not on religious grounds. Their religion does not forbid them to gaze on the Roman symbol of power. Their aversion springs from their enmity to Rome. I say that the Roman eagle is our emblem throughout the whole world, and wherever the power of Rome has spread, the emblem must not be absent." "Is that a command?" I asked. "As you understand it." With Pilate's departure from Jerusalem, I assumed command of the citadel. On one side of the Antonia, facing the new section of the city, there was a deep cleft. I ordered my German horsemen, for whom the Jews had a particular hatred, to take up their position along the cleft. Then I ordered my men to pour oil and fat on that side of the citadel rock which faced the temple, so that the covering of marble blocks became slippery to the foot. At night, when these orders had been carried out, I commanded that the shields with the emblems of our cohort and the images of the Caesar be hung out along the gallery of the citadel. I also had them extinguish the lamp which burned at the summit of the tower where the vestments of the high priest were kept, and substitute in its place the Roman eagle. Early next morning, before sunrise, I stationed myself, together with my guards, in the citadel gallery, to see how the Jews would respond to these dispositions. When the first rays of the sun broke out from behind the eastern hills, we heard the pealing of their trumpets. We saw the first detachment of the priests advancing in regular formation. They were returning from their ablutions to put on the vestments of their office and take over the service. Suddenly, as if at a word of command, they came to a halt. The first sunlight was being flashed back by the eagle and the shields. What a change came over their faces! What a howl went up! It was as though a thunderbolt had smitten their temple and laid it in ruins. Hundreds of trumpets and ram's horns sounded the alarm. Priests and Levites streamed out of the innumerable halls of the temple. Many of them were still half asleep. Many were only half dressed in their service vestments. I had not imagined such numbers. They came swarming out like flocks of birds, old men with curled beards, young men of powerful build, and then youngsters, children almost, innumerable youngsters, neophytes, and students of the priestly schools. The Levites continued to blow their trumpets, and the assembled multitude of priests grew larger and larger. Gradually it drew nearer the citadel. A forest of clenched fists was lifted toward us, and from its midst rose wild shrieks of rage. But before long the alarm had wakened the city, and new crowds poured into the temple area. The women, who did not dare to pass the limits of their court, wailed and lamented at the top of their voices, as if an enemy had broken into the city and was slaughtering their young ones in their sight. A deeper, more ominous roaring came from the men, whose packed masses were drawing nearer and nearer to the citadel. From the side of the cleft there was no approach. The German horsemen were stationed there, and a rain of arrows kept the space before them clear. On the other side, however, the priests, advancing where the common people did not have permission to follow, made the attempt to crawl up the citadel rock. They lifted each other up, they stood on each other's shoulders, they laid themselves on their backs and tried to work their way up. But there were no cracks in the covering of marble blocks, no holds for finger or toenails. They slid back from the oiled surface. Meanwhile, our good Ascalon legionaries, mixed with Samaritans who had been brought from the Jericho garrison, stood in the shelter of the turrets and were overjoyed at this opportunity to teach the insolent Jews a lesson. They shot the climbing figures down, one by one, like birds, and we watched the Jews rolling over, tumbling, to shatter their heads on the stony rock of the platform. Such was their persistence, however, that some of them actually managed to reach the upper rock, and from time to time a hand was laid on the lattice of the gallery. Then an Ascalonite would draw his broadsword, the hand would be severed with a single stroke, and the body would go rolling like a pea down the slope. Sometimes again the Ascalonite would put the climber out of his misery by bringing the blade down on his head. Before the sun had emerged properly from behind the hills, the rock and the walls of our fortress were liberally besprinkled with Judean blood, as liberally as their own altars with the blood of animals, and at the foot of the rock lay a pile of Jewish carcasses. Meanwhile, we saw emerge the high priest in the midst of his entourage. I recognized him by his imposing figure and by the respectful attention evoked by his appearance even in that tumult. The priests, the old men, and the sages assembled about him. They began to calm the hotheads, to recall the men who were trying in vain to storm the citadel. Among the sages and scholars there was one of younger years, yet obviously their leader. Tall, strong of build, he seemed to command universal reverence. Surrounded by his pupils, he addressed himself to the infuriated throngs, and they listened. As I learned later, this was one of their spiritual leaders, one Yochanan ben Zakkai. He had been the pupil of one of their greatest scholars, who had died at a very advanced age. This Yochanan ben Zakkai restrained the hotheads, assisted by old Hanan, the father-in-law of the high priest. I at once recognized Hanan as the head of the deputation which had met us at the gates of Jerusalem. Surrounded by his 5 sons, he approached the citadel walls and made signals that he wished to address us. I sent down a messenger and asked him what he wanted. An audience, was the reply, but I had not power to grant him an audience. I came out into the open on the gallery, though there was danger of being hit by a stone or by the arrow of some hidden marksman, and asked him what he wanted. He spoke Latin with difficulty, but had a good command of Greek. In a poor Latin, mixed with many Greek words, he alluded to the exposed eagle and shields and, as the Jews always did, appealed for their ancient privileges. The great Caesar, and after him the Caesars Augustus and Tiberius, had recognized the Jewish religion and had never transgressed its laws. I had no intention of entering into long arguments with him. I answered in Greek that we in the citadel had not power to alter the orders of the procurator. If the Jews had anything to say, let them address themselves to the procurator in Caesarea. That day, a vast concourse of priests and Levites, headed by old Hanan and accompanied by half the population of Jerusalem, men, women, and children, set out for Caesarea. Jerusalem looked like a deserted city. Within the temple there remained only the priests and Levites needed strictly for the regular service. Avoiding the hostile city of Sichem, the home of the traditional enemies, the Samaritans, they poured across the hills and fields. They did not use the open road, but approached Caesarea along the bypaths. There they were joined by the local Jews, and the united multitude beleaguered the house of the procurator. 5 days and 5 nights Pilate let them camp in the white marble streets of Caesarea, the city built by their own king, and would not give their leaders audience. They had time enough to study the spectacle of the alien heathens dwelling in the marble houses which King Herod had built with their money in honor of the Caesar. They looked on the rich harbor, the gymnasiums, the theaters, the colosseums, the cavalry schools, and, worst of all, the temples, particularly the magnificent temple of Augustus, which the king, with taxes squeezed from his own people, had erected for their enemy. A rabble of children of Caesarea followed them through the streets and threw stones at them. But they bore all these trials and humiliations with infinite and loving patience in the name of their God. During the day they wandered, hungry and thirsty and weary, through the streets. Nights they wandered in the parks and along the alleys by the shore. They lay down to rest on the marble steps of the harbor, and they rose wearier than they had lain down. Still, Pilate would not receive them. In the city which their own money had built, in the heart of their own country, they had to drain to the dregs the cup of bitterness held to their lips by a population of strangers and enemies. On the 5th day, Pilate had them driven like sheep into the big cavalry school, which he had surrounded by mounted German troops. He then admitted into the midst of the Jews detachments of Ascalonites and Samaritans, headed by Greeks. This done, he sent word to the Jews that if they did not disperse quietly to their city and pay honor to the Roman eagle and shields, he would have them trampled like worms by the hoofs of the cavalry. What think you was their response? All of them, from their spiritual leader and the priests down to the women and children, threw themselves on the ground like one man and cried, "You may send against us not only the wild Britons and the German riders, but even the fiercest beasts. We will welcome death 1,000 times before we will pollute our sanctuary with alien symbols." Pollute our sanctuary? Pollute it with the Caesar's picture and the triumphant eagle of Rome? The incredible insolence of the Jews. Had I been Pilate, I would have taken them at their word. But Pilate had in mind something other than the honor of the Caesar's picture and the Roman eagle. He admitted to private audience cunning old Hanan and remained closeted with him for 2 whole hours. What passed between them I do not know, but orders came to us in Jerusalem to remove the images, the shields, and the eagle from the citadel. Rome honors the laws, he wrote to us. The Jews had triumphed. I heard that after the interview between Pilate and the old former high priest Hanan, the former bought his first estate in Sicily and built himself, on the shores of Pompeii, a villa which he presented to his wife Claudia, who was still at the court of Tiberius. They said in Rome that rain falls seldom in Judea, but when it does fall, it is not water, but gold.